Tom, his wife Sarah, and their two children, Jake and Emily, are on a vacation in their motorhome. The destination? An isolated camping area to stay away from the hustle and bustle of the city and enjoy time together. The road is empty, the silence is only broken by the roar of the engine and the laughter of children in the background. The sun is setting, and the desert landscape around them is both peaceful and lonely. But this tranquility is shattered when Tom sees a lonely man on the side of the road. He has his thumb up, asking for a ride, and he looks exhausted, with dirty clothes and a tired face. Sarah, always the kindest one, suggests they help him. Tom hesitates, but decides to stop the motorhome. The man introduces himself as Ethan, a traveler who says he is heading to a small town nearby. He says little about himself, but seems harmless. The family agrees to take him, without knowing that they have just brought danger into their own home on wheels. Welcome to the channel where every ride could be your last. Here, we tell the darkest and most disturbing stories of drivers and passengers who have faced the unexplainable on the roads. If you like feeling that chill down your spine, subscribe now. Hit the bell so you don't miss any chilling stories, and share them with your brave friends. Get ready, because the next race could be yours. Road of no return. Tom felt the weight of the last few weeks lifting as the motorhome rolled down the deserted road. The gentle roar of the engine was almost mesmerizing, and the surrounding landscape, endless miles of arid desert, distant mountains, and cloudless sky, was a welcome relief after months of stressful work. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw his two children, Jake and Emily, playing cards at the makeshift table in the back of the vehicle. Sarah, his wife, was at his side, relaxed with a book in her hands, her face illuminated by the soft evening light. They were finally enjoying their much-deserved vacation, a trip they had planned with enthusiasm, but which always seemed to be postponed because of work or school commitments. The plan was simple: cross the country in a motorhome, visiting parks, lakes, and small towns, disconnecting from the hustle and bustle of modern life. Now that's freedom, thought Tom, smiling to himself. He always wanted to go on a trip like this with his family. It was a chance to reconnect with Sarah and the kids, enjoy quiet time on the road, and create memories away from the city. Do you want to change? Sarah offered, closing the book for a moment. I can drive a little if you want to rest. I'm fine, Tom replied, keeping his eyes on the road. I'm going to enjoy it a little longer. I think I'm starting to get used to this road. Look, no traffic, no noise, just us and the road. You look like a professional truck driver, Sarah joked, giving her husband a gentle push on the shoulder. The road ahead seemed endless, winding through the desert and disappearing into the horizon. That was the kind of peace they were looking for, a completely different world from the busy city life. As they drove, the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, reflecting off the distant mountains and creating a postcard scene. Guys, look at the sunset, Sarah exclaimed, turning to her children. That's the kind of thing we don't see every day, huh? Jake and Emily looked out the window, their faces reflecting the golden glow of the setting sun. It was a spectacular sight, and for a brief moment, the motorhome was completely silent as everyone took in the beauty around them. It was worth it, huh? Tom said, taking Sarah's hand as she smiled in response. It was everything he wanted, moments of simplicity and beauty with his family. But, as with any long trip, not everything was under control. As the sun finally sank below the horizon and darkness began to set in, Tom noticed something up ahead. A lone silhouette on the side of the road, thumb raised, asking for a ride. It was a male figure with simple clothes, a backpack at his side, and a tired expression. He looked like he had been there for hours. "Look," Tom commented, pointing at the figure. "I think someone needs a ride." Sarah quickly looked out the window. "Tom, we're in the middle of nowhere. Do you think it's safe to stop?" Tom hesitated for a second. He knew that stopping for a stranger in the middle of a deserted road wasn't the best idea, but the man seemed harmless at first glance. Furthermore, he knew that Sarah had a kind heart and always cared about helping others. "He looks tired." "And it's a long road," Tom replied, already slowing down the motorhome. "I think we can take it to the next town. It won't cost us anything." Sarah looked at her children, who were distracted by their card games, and then back at the man in the road. "Only until the next town," she said, her tone firm. The motorhome stopped next to the man, and Tom rolled down the driver's window. "Need a ride?" he asked, trying to sound friendly. The man smiled, grateful. He had a dirty face and looked like he had spent many hours in the sun. His hair was disheveled and his clothes were worn out. "Ah, man, you don't know how much I appreciate it," he replied, leaning out the window. "I've been waiting for someone to pass by for hours. There are hardly any cars on this road, you know." Tom nodded. "Yes, it is an isolated area." "Where are you going?" "Only until the next town," replied the man, pointing vaguely north. "I'm trying to get home, but my car broke down and I have no signal on my cell phone. If you could take me there, I would really appreciate it." Tom exchanged a look with Sarah, who looked a little uncomfortable, but said nothing. He looked back at the man and felt that despite his tired and slightly worn appearance, he didn't seem to be a threat. "All right, you can get in. We'll take you to the next town," Tom said, opening the passenger door. "There's just one detail, we're with our children, so I hope you understand the need for safety." The man smiled again and climbed into the motorhome, placing his backpack on the floor. "Of course, man, of course. I completely understand. Thank you so much, you guys are saving my life." He got into the passenger seat next to Tom, while Sarah watched everything closely. That feeling of discomfort was still present, but Tom's kindness in helping someone in need seemed enough to eliminate any doubts at that moment. The motorhome started to roll down the deserted road again, but the atmosphere inside the vehicle had changed. The darkness outside seemed thicker, and the silence that was once relaxing was now heavy. The man introduced himself as Ethan, and as the trip progressed, he began talking to Tom and Sarah. "This road is pretty deserted, right?" Ethan commented, looking out the window at the dark expanse of the desert. "It doesn't seem like many people come here." "It's a quiet area," Tom replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "But it's good for a family trip. Peace and quiet, you know?" Ethan nodded, but there was something about the way he watched the road that made Sarah shift uncomfortably in her seat. What was supposed to be a relaxing trip started to become tense. As the conversation continued, Ethan began to mention an alternative route. "Have you ever passed the road that cuts north?" asked Ethan, casually. "It's much faster, it takes you straight to the city without having to make a big detour. I used it a lot when I worked as a truck driver." Tom frowned, not remembering seeing that road on the map, but the idea of a shorter route interested him. He looked at Sarah, who was looking at him with worried eyes, and then back at Ethan. "No, I didn't know about that road." "Are you sure it's faster?" "Yes, without a doubt," Ethan replied quickly. "It's a dirt road, but it's quiet. It'll save you at least an hour of travel." The hesitation was palpable, and Sarah finally voiced her concerns. "Tom, I don't think we should go off the planned route. We're fine this way, we don't need to save time. I'd rather stay on the main road." Tom looked at Sarah and then at Ethan, who still had that friendly smile, but something about him seemed a little forced. The atmosphere inside the motorhome grew thicker, but Tom still felt caught between being polite and doing what seemed safest. "Perhaps it would be best to continue on the route we know," Tom said, his voice firm. "We don't want to get lost on a dirt road at night." Ethan shrugged, but the smile on his face faded a little. Sure, whatever you want," he said, looking out the window again, but now his gaze seemed more attentive, almost calculating. The trip continued for a few more hours, with Ethan remaining silent for most of the time, which only increased the feeling of discomfort. The darkness outside seemed increasingly oppressive, and the desert around the motorhome now seemed like a prison rather than a setting for freedom. The sound of the engine echoed in the heavy silence, until suddenly Ethan leaned forward. "Hey, there's a gas station up ahead," he said, pointing into the darkness. "We can stop there. I was thinking about getting something to drink. Maybe buy you some things too." Tom looked in the direction indicated, and sure enough, there was a small glow on the horizon, faint lights that indicated an establishment. "We're well fueled," said Tom, trying to make conversation, but Sarah sensed the nervousness in her husband's tone. "It'll be quick," Ethan insisted, this time his voice firmer, less friendly. The motorhome finally arrived near the gas station. It was an old place, with a worn-out sign and a single working fuel pump. There were no other vehicles there, and the place looked abandoned except for the dimly blinking lights inside the convenience store. Tom looked at Sarah again, seeking silent confirmation that it was best to move on, but before he could respond, Ethan had already left the motorhome. "I'm going to get some drinks, I'll be right back," he said, disappearing towards the store. As soon as Ethan entered the station, Sarah turned to Tom, her voice shaking slightly. "Tom, something is wrong. I don't trust him. We need to get out of here now." Tom nodded, feeling the same shiver down his spine that Sarah felt. He looked at his children in the back of the motorhome, who were still distracted, not realizing what was happening. "Okay, let's get out of here," Tom said, starting the engine back up. But just as he tried to put the vehicle in motion, a noisy old pickup truck came out of the shadows and blocked the road ahead. Tom's heart skipped a beat. Damn! How did they know we were here? Two men got out of the truck, both with rough appearance and tattoos on their arms. They had a threatening posture and began to walk slowly towards the motorhome, while Ethan reappeared from the store, now with a very different expression than before. "What's up, Tom?" Ethan said, his tone now cold and calculated. "Did you think you were going to leave me behind?" Sarah held Tom's hand, her face pale with fear. "Tom, we need to get out of here. Now." Tom tried to reverse, but before he could react, one of the men in the truck broke the passenger door glass with a baseball bat, while Ethan held the cabin door, preventing any attempt to escape. "Welcome to the wrong road," Ethan said, his voice thick with contempt. "Now you will understand how it really works." Panic took over the motorhome as soon as Tom realized there was no way out. Ethan was back, now with his menacing smile. The two men who got out of the truck approached, while Sarah and the children watched in terror. Jake and Emily, who had previously been distracted by their games, now realized the gravity of the situation. Tom desperately tried to accelerate the vehicle, but the motorhome was stuck, with no room to maneuver. The sound of the door being broken and glass shattering echoed inside the vehicle. The man with the baseball bat, a burly guy with tattoos on his arms, opened the passenger door and faced Tom with a mischievous smile. "Where do you think you're going?" said the man, his voice deep and full of contempt. Ethan, outside, was already approaching closer. "You're not going anywhere. From now on, you're under our control." His tone was cold and emotionless. Sarah held Tom's hand, her breathing labored. "Tom, what are we going to do?" she asked in a whisper, trying to control her growing dread. Tom looked at his children in the back of the vehicle and knew he needed to do something, anything, to protect his family. "Don't do anything stupid," said the man in the truck, as he pushed open the door and pulled Tom out of the motorhome. Tom tried to resist, but the man's strength was overwhelming. He was thrown onto the rough floor of the gas station, feeling the impact on his body. Sarah screamed from inside the vehicle, while the other men held the door so she couldn't get out. "Let's take you to our special place," Ethan said as he looked at his cronies. "Get the motorhome and follow the plan. We don't want to draw too much attention around here." The men laughed, clearly familiar with what was about to happen. One of the men climbed into the driver's seat of the motorhome, while the other continued to watch Tom and Sarah. Ethan observed the scene calmly, as if he were just going through a routine. "Take them to the shed," Ethan said with authority. "Let's give the family an unforgettable experience." The motorhome was driven by Ethan's henchmen, and Tom was forcibly placed in the vehicle, along with Sarah and the children. Panic took over everyone. The children began to cry, and Sarah could barely contain her despair. "Please let us go," she pleaded. "We didn't do anything." "You guys are perfect," Ethan replied, almost laughing. "We need people like you. Relax, it won't be long." The motorhome was driven down a narrow, unlit road. The desolate landscape only increased the feeling of terror. The vehicle followed an increasingly isolated path until, in the distance, they saw an old and gloomy warehouse, surrounded by tall grass and completely isolated from any trace of civilization. When they arrived at the warehouse, the men forcibly removed the family from the motorhome. Tom tried to resist, but was brutally dominated by one of the men, who pushed him to the ground once again. Sarah and the children screamed, but they were powerless. The men dragged the family into the warehouse, where true terror awaited them. The warehouse was a sinister structure, with rusty walls and windows blocked by metal plates. Inside, the scene was even more macabre. The place was equipped with torture instruments, rusty chairs, and there were chains hanging from the ceiling. The dim lights illuminated only parts of the room, creating shadows that danced on the walls and increasing the feeling of horror. The family was separated. Tom was taken to a small back room, while Sarah and the children were locked in another adjacent room. The sound of chains echoed through the warehouse, and the family's screams of despair mixed with the metallic sound of the environment. Tom tried to fight back, but was chained to a chair, with his hands tied tightly behind his back. Ethan entered the room, now without any trace of kindness. "You did everything wrong, Tom. You could have prevented this. But it's too late now. You're part of something bigger." Tom looked at Ethan with pure hatred in his eyes. "Why? Why are you doing this? What do you want from us?" Ethan shrugged, as if this was just a regular job for him. "It's not personal, Tom. We only do what we do because there are people willing to pay for it. And in the end, everyone wins, except you." He raised his arm and showed his fist, where there was a tattoo of a strange symbol. This is the symbol of our organization. And you, Tom, have been chosen to be part of a very special game." Meanwhile, in the other room, Sarah was trying to comfort Jake and Emily, who were in shock. The door was locked, and Tom's screams could be heard in the distance. Sarah knew she needed to do something to protect her children, but the chains that bound her were heavy and strong. Fear dominated her, but she wouldn't give up without a fight. "Mommy, what's going to happen to us?" Jake asked, with tears in his eyes. "I don't know, honey," Sarah replied, struggling to remain calm. "But we're going to get out of here. I promise we will." As Tom tried to absorb what Ethan had said, the shed began to reveal its true purpose. The men who worked with Ethan were part of a torture and murder network, where the rich and powerful paid to see ordinary people pushed to the limit of their pain and fear. It was a sadistic experience for those who knew no moral boundaries. Tom, Sarah, and their children had fallen into a well-laid trap. The warehouse was the epicenter of a macabre show where victims were tortured for the entertainment of paying spectators. The terror in Tom's eyes was replaced by anger and determination. Ethan approached Tom with a cold expression. "You and your family were chosen for a simple reason. You are normal. Ordinary people who represent the routine of those who are out there watching. They will see every scream, every tear, and they will pay handsomely for it." Tom felt a lump in his throat. He knew he was in a life or death situation, and that his only chance of survival was to fight despite being chained. He pulled hard on the chains, trying to find any weakness he could use. "You're not getting out of here, Tom," Ethan said, reading his mind. "But if you want to say goodbye to your family, I can be merciful." The cruelty in Ethan's tone made Tom squirm with rage. "Go to hell," cried Tom, his voice full of fury. Ethan shrugged again and left the room, leaving Tom alone and trapped. The lights in the shed flickered, and the deathly silence was broken only by the distant sound of chains and the sobs of Sarah and the children in the other room. The only thing Tom knew was that he would need a miracle to get out of there alive and save his family. The warehouse was plunged into oppressive darkness, lit only by dim lights and the occasional flash of faulty electricity that flickered on the metal walls. Tom breathed deeply. The sound of his own breathing was deafening in the absolute silence of the room in which he was trapped. He tugged on the chains once more, feeling the metal biting into his skin as his wrists began to bleed lightly. The pain was beginning to mix with despair. Tom thought about Sarah, Jake, and Emily. With every second that passed, he knew that the situation was becoming more critical. He had no time to hesitate, and the anger of being at the mercy of those monsters only fueled his determination. He couldn't let his family be tortured and killed by a sadistic network of killers. With renewed effort, he looked around the room, looking for anything he could use to free himself. The shed was an old, makeshift place. Rust on the walls, leaks dripping from the ceiling, and the metal chairs he was trapped in were poorly fixed to the floor. That was it. He could use this to his advantage. With a sudden movement, Tom began to rock the chair side to side, forcing the structure to loosen. The screws holding the chair together began to creak, and he felt a slight give in the floor. Come on," he muttered to himself, sweating and feeling the pressure increase. With each movement, his wrists ripped more from the chains, but that wouldn't stop him. He knew time was running out. Meanwhile, in the other room, Sarah was in despair, but she also knew she needed to remain calm to protect her children. Jake, 14, and Emily, 10, were huddled in a corner, hugging their mother, tears silently streaming down their faces. They didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, but they knew something horrible was about to happen. "Mom, Dad is going to get us out of here, isn't he?" Jake asked, his voice weak and hesitant. Sarah tried to be strong, but her voice was shaky. "Yes, darling. Your father will get us out of here. He always finds a way." Deep down, she was terrified, but she couldn't show it to her children. "We need to be strong now, right? We need to be brave for when your father comes." Emily sobbed, holding tight to Sarah's shirt. "I'm scared, Mommy." "I know, honey," Sarah whispered, trying to calm her. "But we're together. And as long as we're together, we're going to get out of here. We need to believe that." The iron door creaked with every movement of the children, but outside, footsteps could be heard, heavy and slow, as if someone were prowling the area. Sarah knew they didn't have much time before they were taken. She looked around the small, empty room, looking for something she could use to defend herself, but the place looked like a tomb of concrete and iron. There was nowhere to run. Back in Tom's room, the effort finally started to pay off. With a loud crack, one of the screws came completely loose, and the chair it was attached to began to tilt. Tom put all his weight to the side, forcing the chair to break. As she fell to the ground, the shackles on his wrists loosened, allowing him to move a little more freely. He pulled hard on the chains, feeling the metal finally give way. His wrists were raw and bleeding, but he was free. Tom took a deep breath, knowing this was the only chance he had to save his family. He stood up quickly, but was careful not to make any noise. He knew that if he was discovered before finding Sarah and the children, everything would be lost. He approached the metal door blocking his exit and listened carefully. There was no sound outside. Tom knew the captors could be nearby, but he had to take the risk. With one smooth movement, he opened the door, the metallic creak sounding like an explosion in the silence. Tom peered into the narrow hallway ahead, dark and dirty, like everything else in the warehouse. He followed with cautious steps, keeping to the shadows and trying to move as quickly as possible. As he walked through the halls, Tom passed several doors similar to his, all locked. It was impossible to know how many other victims were trapped there, awaiting the same cruel fate he and his family were about to face. He couldn't afford to help other people right now. His only priority was finding Sarah, Jake, and Emily. After a few harrowing minutes, Tom finally found a door that was ajar. He heard low voices on the other side, familiar voices. Tom's heart raced, and he pushed the door open carefully. Inside, he saw Sarah kneeling on the floor, holding her children in her arms. The relief on Sarah's face when she saw Tom was instantaneous. "Tom," she whispered, trying not to attract attention, but clearly thrilled to see him. "We need to get out of here, now," Tom said, keeping his voice low. "I managed to free myself, but they could come back at any moment." Jake and Emily ran into their father's arms, still shaking with fear. "Dad, I thought you weren't coming back," Jake said, hugging Tom tightly. "I always come back," Tom replied, trying to sound confident but aware of the impending danger. Sarah stood up, holding the children's hands. "How are we going to get out of here, Tom? They're everywhere." Tom glanced through the door, making sure the hallway was clear. "I don't know yet, but we have to be quick. If we stay here, we don't have a chance." He led them out of the room, moving quickly through the narrow hallways. The occasional sound of chains echoed through the warehouse, and the fear of being caught was almost unbearable. Tom knew they needed to find a way out, but the warehouse was like a maze. As they advanced through the corridors, the captors' footsteps began to approach. Tom knew they were being followed. "Hurry," he whispered to Sarah and the children. "They're after us." They turned a corner and came across a metal door that seemed to lead outside. Tom tried to open it, but the door was locked with a heavy padlock. Desperation took over for a brief moment, but he knew he couldn't stop. "We need to find another way out," he said, stepping back as the captor's footsteps grew louder. Tom saw a window high on the wall. It was narrow, but it could be an escape route for children. "Jake, Emily, you go up first," he ordered. "I'll help you through the window, and then we'll follow." With Tom's help, Jake and Emily climbed into the narrow window and managed to get through to the other side. Sarah followed soon after, with Tom pushing her out with all his might. Finally, Tom prepared to climb, but he heard the footsteps getting even closer. The captors turned the corner of the hallway, and Tom's eyes met theirs for a brief second. Without hesitation, he climbed through the window, managing to escape before they could reach him. Outside, Sarah, Jake, and Emily were waiting, breathing hard but safe for now. Tom fell to the ground next to them, his body exhausted and sore, but relieved to be out of this nightmare, at least for now. "We need a car," said Tom, panting. "They're going to hunt us down. We have to get out of here." Sarah looked around, and then spotted an old pickup truck parked in the distance. "There," she exclaimed. "Let's get that car." Wasting no time, the family ran toward the truck, with the sound of their captors still echoing behind them. Time was running out. The air outside the warehouse was cold and heavy, filled with the smell of metal and dry earth. Tom, Sarah, Jake, and Emily were panting, but there was no time to rest. They had barely escaped the clutches of their captors, but they knew they were still being hunted. The window through which they had fled now seemed like a narrow portal between life and death. But the nightmare was not over yet. The old truck Sarah saw seemed to be her only chance to escape. The vehicle was covered in dust, its windows were so opaque that you could barely see inside. Tom knew they needed to be quick. Looking around, he noticed that the warehouse was surrounded by vast, empty fields, with no sign of help nearby. "Hurry, let's go to that truck," Tom ordered firmly. He looked at his children and saw the fear in Jake and Emily's eyes, but he also felt a small flicker of hope. They were alive and together, and that was all that mattered now. "What if the key isn't there?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking as they ran towards the vehicle. "I'll find a way," Tom replied with determination. "I won't let those bastards touch you again." When they reached the truck, Tom tried to open the door, but, as he feared, it was locked. He looked around, looking for something he could use to break the glass. There was no time to think of another solution. They could hear the approaching footsteps and voices of their captors. "Tom!" Sarah exclaimed, pointing to the shed. They could see the silhouettes of the armed men leaving through the main door, still not noticing that the family was fleeing. Tom knew he didn't have much time. "Stay behind me," he said, looking for a rock on the ground. He grabbed the first one he found and, with one quick movement, broke the driver's window. The sound of shattering glass echoed in the silence of the night, but there was no choice. Tom opened the door from the inside and got into the truck. "Sarah, Jake, Emily, get in, quick." The family got into the vehicle, still panicking, but relieved to be together. Tom desperately searched for the ignition panel. Fortunately, the key was in the contact. "Thank God," he murmured, turning the key and feeling the ancient engine roar to life. But before he could put the car in gear and get out of there, the sound of heavy footsteps quickly approached. Ethan and the other captors had finally found them. Tom looked in the rearview mirror and saw Ethan, now without hiding the anger and sadistic pleasure on his face. He was holding a gun, and the other men around him were also armed. "Speed up, Tom," Sarah shouted, panicked. Tom didn't hesitate. He pressed the pedal hard and the truck squealed its tires through the desert dust. But Ethan and his men weren't going to let the family get away so easily. Tom heard the sound of gunshots echoing in the distance. The bullets whizzed past the truck, one of them hitting the rear window, shattering it completely. "Everyone, get down," Tom shouted as he tried to maintain control of the steering. The desert ahead was a mix of rugged terrain and poorly marked trails. Tom drove with all the skill he had, but he knew that a chase in a place like that was risky. The motorhome was left behind, as was any semblance of normality. Now, they were in a desperate fight for survival. The old truck shook violently as Tom tried to flee at high speed along the dirt roads. The vehicle was old, and the weak suspension made every pothole in the road feel like a free fall. The children were huddled in the back seat, with Sarah holding Emily and Jake trying to protect his mother. "Daddy, they're shooting at us," Jake shouted, his voice thick with panic. "I know, son," Tom replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "But I won't let them get to us." In the rearview mirror, he could see the headlights of his captors' cars approaching. They were moving fast, and the volleys of gunfire didn't stop. Tom knew that if they wanted to escape, they would need a miracle. The desert was treacherous and without cover. All they could do was keep advancing and pray that the bandits would make a mistake. "There's a hill up ahead," Tom said, pointing to a rock formation that loomed in the distance. "If we can get there, maybe we can lose them." Sarah looked up at the hill and nodded. "We have to try. We can't continue on this road forever." The truck bounced over the undulations of the ground, the engine roaring as if it were about to break down. Tom pushed the pedal to the limit, feeling the steering wheel shake in his hands. The headlights of the pursuing cars were still behind, but he knew the hill might be his last hope. As they approached the hill, the path became steeper and rockier. Tom knew it would be difficult for the captors' cars to get up there. He looked at Sarah, who was still holding her children. "When we're at the top, we'll get out of the car and run," he said. "If they try to follow us on foot, we'll have a chance." Sarah looked at him with an expression of pure fear, but she trusted her husband. "Let's do this, Tom. For our children's sake." As soon as they reached the top of the hill, Tom stopped the truck abruptly. The engine hissed and smoked, but they had managed to gain a small advantage over their pursuers. Wasting no time, Tom opened the door and helped Sarah and the children out of the car. "Run," he shouted, guiding them behind some large rocks that offered cover. They could hear the engines of Ethan and his men's cars in the distance, but they knew that the bandits would have difficulty following the same path with their vehicles. The group hid behind the rocks, breathing hard and trying to compose themselves. Tom knew they didn't have much time before their captors caught up to them on foot. He looked around, looking for something he could use as a weapon, but there, in the middle of the desert, there wasn't much besides rocks and dust. "Daddy, what now?" Emily asked, holding her father's hand tightly. Tom looked at his children and then at Sarah. "Now, let's fight." It was at that moment that Tom saw one of Ethan's men coming up the hill, carrying a gun. He was moving fast, and soon others appeared behind him. Tom picked up a large rock and positioned himself, waiting for the right moment to act. When the first man got close enough, Tom threw the rock with all his might. The stone hit the man in the chest, causing him to lose his balance and fall down the hill. Tom knew this would only delay the inevitable, but it was a small victory. "Tom!" Sarah shouted, pointing at Ethan, who was now closer. He had a gun in his hands and a cruel smile on his face. "You have nowhere to run," Ethan said, his voice thick with triumph. "This hill will be your grave." Tom was determined to protect his family at any cost, even if it meant facing Ethan and his men alone. He knew there was no easy way out of this nightmare, but he also knew he couldn't let Ethan get close to Sarah, Jake, and Emily. When he saw his wife and children running down the hillside, a feeling of urgency came over him. "They have to escape," thought Tom. "They can't end up here." Ethan was getting closer and closer, his gun firmly aimed at Tom. The cold smile on Ethan's face seemed to grow with each step, as if he was already certain of his victory. "Do you really think you can stop me, Tom?" Ethan scoffed. "You're just another victim along the way. You think fighting will change anything? This is the end for you." Tom took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Ethan's words, but he refused to believe that this was the end. He wouldn't allow Ethan to win. With his mind spinning for a solution, Tom looked around, trying to find something he could use to gain an advantage. The hill was full of rocks, but he needed something more, something that could really make a difference. "You talk too much, Ethan," Tom said, trying to remain calm. "I'm not going to let you touch my family. And if you want to end me, you're going to have to work for it." Ethan laughed, his voice echoing through the deserted night. "Do you really think you can stop me?" He took another step forward, keeping the gun pointed directly at Tom's chest. "I've been doing this for a long time. Families like yours are easy to destroy. You're all the same, you think you have a chance, but in the end, everyone falls." Tom felt a chill run down his spine, but his hands weren't shaking. "Maybe," he replied, "but I'm still here. And you haven't caught me yet." Ethan shook his head, as if he were dealing with a stubborn child. "This ends now, Tom." He raised the gun, ready to shoot. But before he could pull the trigger, Tom threw himself to the ground, grabbing a large rock with his hands. He threw it with all his strength, hitting Ethan's hand and sending the weapon flying away. Ethan let out a cry of pain, holding his wrist as he looked at Tom with pure hatred. "You will pay for this," Ethan roared, lunging at Tom. The two men collided hard, rolling down the rocky slope. The hand-to-hand fighting was brutal. Tom was exhausted, but the adrenaline in his body kept him on his feet. He knew he couldn't lose. Ethan, on the other hand, was furious. His pride had been hurt, and now he was willing to crush Tom with his bare hands. The two fought in the darkness, exchanging punches and blows as they rolled between the rocks. Tom felt Ethan's fists hit his ribs hard, but he fought back, catching Ethan's chin with a hard blow. Ethan stumbled, staggering back, but quickly recovered, moving forward again. "Do you think you know me, Tom?" Ethan shouted as they fought. "You think you know who I am? I've destroyed families bigger than yours. And you'll just be another one in my path." Tom didn't respond. His hands found a larger rock, and he used it to hit Ethan in the side of the head, knocking him to the ground. Ethan fell with a scream, his head hitting the rocks, leaving him stunned for a moment. Seizing the advantage, Tom stood up, panting and bloody, but determined. He looked at Ethan's fallen body, knowing this wasn't over yet. Ethan started to move, trying to get up, but he was visibly shaken. Tom knew he needed to act quickly. "You're not going to stop me," Ethan hissed, still trying to compose himself. "You don't have what it takes." But Tom wasn't listening anymore. He ran towards the weapon that had been thrown away during the fight. When he picked it up, he felt the weight of the metal in his hands and knew there was no other option. Ethan had to be stopped once and for all. Ethan stood up, staggering, his eyes filled with hate. "Are you going to kill me, Tom? Is that what you think you're going to do? You don't have the courage." Tom raised the gun, pointing it directly at Ethan. "You won't hurt anyone again." There was a moment of tense silence. The wind blew gently through the rocks, and the desert seemed to watch the final confrontation between the two men. Ethan opened his mouth to say something, but before he could utter any words, Tom pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed across the hill. Ethan fell to the ground, motionless. Tom stood still for a moment, breathing heavily, feeling the impact of the decision he had just made. But he knew he had no other choice. It was him or Ethan, and he had chosen to live to save his family. After the confrontation, Tom knew there was no time to waste. He ran towards the place where Sarah and the children were hiding. When he arrived, he saw Sarah holding the children, still shaking, but relieved to see Tom return. "Tom, are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Tom nodded, even though his body was exhausted and sore. "I'm fine. But we need to go. They might still be after us." Without wasting any more time, Tom led his family along a narrow path that led down the other side of the hill. The path was irregular and dangerous, but it was the only route they had to escape that cursed place. The sound of the other captors still echoed in the distance, but now it seemed more distant. Maybe they had gotten lost on the hill, or maybe they were trying to find Ethan. The walk along the trail seemed endless. Sarah carried Emily, who was too tired to keep walking, and Jake stood firm at his father's side, trying to be brave despite his fear. Tom constantly looked over his shoulder, hoping to see some sign of their captors, but the darkness of the desert enveloped them completely. When they finally reached the bottom of the hill, the family saw a road in the distance, illuminated by the headlights of cars that occasionally passed by. The sight of the road brought a new wave of hope. "We're almost there," Tom said, trying to stay calm. "Let's get on that road and ask for help." Walking towards the road, the family finally felt like they were leaving the nightmare behind. Tom looked at Sarah and the children and felt a deep sense of relief that they were together. The horror of what they had gone through was still fresh in their minds, but the important thing was that they had survived. Upon reaching the side of the road, Tom signaled an approaching car. The driver stopped immediately upon seeing the family's desperate condition. "Please help us," Tom said to the man, his voice tired and desperate. The driver, visibly worried, agreed to take them to the nearest city. Tom, Sarah, Jake, and Emily got into the car, exhausted and relieved. As the vehicle took them away from the desert, Tom looked in the rearview mirror, seeing the lights on the road receding. Finally, they were safe. The family was taken to a hospital in the nearest city, where they received treatment for the physical injuries and trauma they had suffered. The case was quickly reported to local police, who began investigating the shadowy organization behind the events at the warehouse. The torture network of Ethan and his henchmen was exposed, but many mysteries still remained. Tom, Sarah, Jake, and Emily were finally safe, but they knew the nightmare would follow them in their minds for a long time. Each of them bore scars, both physical and emotional, from the dark hours they had faced in the desert. As they recovered, Tom looked out the hospital window and wondered how many other families had been captured by that sadistic organization. He knew that although his family had survived, the nightmare was not over. The organization behind the kidnapping and torture of innocent people was still at large, spread out in obscure places, recruiting new victims. He wondered how many people, just like him, had been led to believe they could escape only to be destroyed. Tom felt a weight on his shoulders, a feeling of impotence at not being able to do more to completely dismantle that horror. In the hospital room, Sarah, Jake, and Emily rested, exhausted but finally safe. Tom looked at them and felt profound relief. "They're here with me," he thought. "We survived, despite everything." But the fear and emotional scars wouldn't disappear so easily. He knew the family would never be the same after that event. Each had faced terror in different ways, and the road to healing would be long. The days that followed were a blur of interviews with police and statements about what had happened. Authorities were shocked by the brutality of the organization behind the kidnappings and torture, and the case soon gained media attention. Ethan and his cronies who were captured were just the tip of the iceberg. There was a much larger network hidden in the shadows. Tom cooperated with the investigation, but knew his priority was his family. Sarah stayed by his side the entire time, despite the nightmares she and the children began to have at night. Jake and Emily, so young, now had a distant look in their eyes, as if they had seen something that had changed them forever. "We'll get through this," Tom told them constantly. "We are together and we will heal, step by step." But he knew the words sounded empty to the children, who were still processing everything that had happened. The police managed to locate the warehouse where everything happened and arrest more members of the organization, but Tom knew that this was not the end. Other families were not as lucky. The system that allowed people to pay to torture and kill was rooted in something much deeper, something that had not yet been fully discovered. Tom, as he looked out the window, knew that despite everything, he had something other victims didn't, the chance to continue. He was alive, and so was his family. They had been tested to their limits, but somehow they had managed to survive. That, for Tom, was what really mattered. But somewhere, in the shadows of the world, he knew that evil still lurked, waiting for its next victim. Did you like this story? Do you have something incredible to share? If you or someone you know has had a hair-raising experience in traffic, whether as a driver or passenger, send your story. Who knows, it might appear in our next video. Send your report in the comments or by email, and let's explore the mysteries of the road together.